Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Speak Your Own Book podcast. My name is Chris Copeland, and I am your host on this journey of words, wisdom, and wonders. We're back for another enriching episode of Speak Your Own Book. First, I do want to extend my heartfelt thanks for your patience and understanding during our brief pause over the last few weeks. It's been a time of reflection and rejuvenation as I've navigated the all too familiar waters of burnout once again. But it is a reminder that even in our passionate pursuits, even in doing the things that we love, we must learn to listen to our own rhythms and respect the need for rest and recovery. So I also encourage all of our listeners to do the same thing with their own bodies and their own minds and their own hearts. Today, we pivot from our regular series exploring the Speak Your Own Book textbook and course to bring you a truly special episode. We are honored to welcome Reverend Donald Lewis, a luminary in the pagan community and the esteemed author of the Correllian Book of the Dead, his latest book in a series of Correllian books. In this exclusive conversation, we'll be unveiling the mysteries of Correllianism, a path steeped in wisdom, spiritual depth, and ancestral reverence. So gather around, whether you're tuning in from near or far, as we embark on this enlightening exploration with Reverend Don. Prepare to immerse yourself in the rich tapestry of his experiences and insights, a journey that promises to enlighten and inspire. Let's turn the page to this captivating chapter in our Speak Your Own Book series and welcome Reverend Donald Lewis.
Good morning. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thank you, Reverend Don. And how are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Good to hear. Good to
Very glad
hear.
to be here.
Yes, and for full disclosure, Speak Your Own Book did the editing work for this project, and we're very proud to be a part of the project. And there's the print copy. Excellent. And I love the beautiful cover. Excellent
Thank you.
purple selection there. Yeah.
Purple
So
is always a good choice.
absolutely, it's my favorite color. So, yeah, and I'll also switch it over really quickly so everyone can see the online website to buy it, correllianpublishing.com. Just go there. It's on the homepage. I believe it's the third on the top row of books. And you can order it for pre-order. And I believe it's already live, though, for 11.
Oh yeah.
Yes,
It,
so it's been live for.
I need to update it so that it doesn't say pre-order, but everything is working.
Yeah, so even though it says pre-order, go ahead and buy it, and you will have it shipped to you. Or if you choose do we have an ebook version as well? I believe.
Not yet, no.
Not yet. Okay, so we'll have that hopefully coming very soon to you. But you can order the print book for only $12.95. That is a real steal, especially in today's economy for a book that has this much information packed into it. Reverend Don, first off, just tell us a little bit about the reason for the book itself, what compelled you to write it, why this time is it most important to have this book? Uh,
Um, there are a couple of answers to that. One, people have been asking for the Correllian Book of the Dead for a while. And I don't know if I wasn't ready to write it yet, or I just had too many other things on my plate. This year, I have retired in office from the office that I have held for 44 years now as first priest with the Correllian Tradition. And I spent a lot of this year recovering from a serious coronary incident, which put me very much in mind of issues involving death. So when it came a little later in the year, I decided that maybe it was time to finally write this book and to put together many of the Correllian teachings about death and dying and the nature of the soul, most of which we've talked about somewhere in our literature elsewhere, but not all of which, and not all the same things. So most of what's in the book, people will not have seen previously. I won't say none of it, but most of it.
yes, that's definitely what I felt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's definitely what I felt as well reading through it. A few of the pieces looked familiar. Like I believe I'd read one of the rituals before in I'm not sure if it's the first or second degree book, but the one that has, or maybe it's just the rituals in practice. It could be that in theory and practice. Yeah.
It
Yeah.
There are a couple of rituals in the book. One of them, um, the ritual of crossing over probably does show up in second degree. The funeral ritual was in the rites of passage class that I don't know that many people have ever had.
I believe
And
I've
it's
taken
also
it.
been, yeah, I mean, 20 years ago, it was more current. So for a mass publication, it's the first time that's been out there. And that's true for several of these things.
Yes, and yeah, and I love the fact that we were able to update it, to change some of the language, to
Hmm.
be more modern, more of today's world, and that was a great. It's great to know that you belong to a community where,
Yeah.
as wisdom grows over time, your beliefs don't stay static. It wasn't something written 6,000 years ago, and that's it. No more refinement, no more improvement of anything. This is a growing, living, breathing faith.
And that's a very important point. One of the things I like to talk about is that it's not enough for us to pass along the things that we ourselves learned. We have to continue to grow them. We have to continue to develop them. And I've said before, if I were it, when I am in the fullness of time, reincarnated, hopefully back into this place, I would be very disappointed if I found everything the same, because it should not be. Our rituals as we practice them today are certainly not the sort of thing I would have thought my grandmother would be practicing in the 20s. Some of the things are, many of the ideas are, but the exact embellishments went through a lot of changes in the 60s, in the late 20th century, and a lot of influences that were not previously there. And I would expect that to happen as we go forward. One of the things that's happened in Correllianism is that we have branches all over the world, and they change our general practice. We have a huge Correllian branch in the Philippines that's very active and is influencing all of Correllianism, I believe. They certainly should be, um, with an influence that would not have been available in my grandmother's time.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's something that even today I was happily surprised by when I came onto the restream here, and I saw that there was another episode scheduled for next Monday, and it's Transgender Remembrance Day.
Yes,
Well, that's something we would not have had 50 years ago because that word
that's true.
exist. Even though the people existed, we still hadn't recognize them as a community as valid, and so seeing that we can even continuously make progress to become kinder and better
Hmm.
people, that's the religion that I like. Yeah,
Absolutely. And it's only natural that society evolves, attitudes change, and if you don't change with it, you get left behind.
absolutely. Yeah.
And all religions change. Some of them simply don't like to admit that they do.
Yes,
But
yes.
we consider it to be a good thing to develop and grow, and to hold on to what's important, to hold on
Absolutely.
to. Lady Crystal, um, the retired first priestess, also still in office after 44 years, um, but very long retired now. But she was my teacher, and she borrowed a phrase from the Bear tribe, they were called. I'm not sure that they're even still around, but they were a group that she had some familiarity with, and it was that you do what grows corn, which is a way of saying you do what works. If it doesn't work, why are you doing it? It can work in different ways. Sometimes it works simply by preserving an important tradition. That is also working sometimes. But it needs to have a valuable function, or it's not really productive. And as you say, society changes. Technology has changed tremendously. And, how we do ritual now. In many cases, we're doing it online in a way that uses many of the same aspects of an in-person ritual, which we certainly still do, but it happens differently. It has to, because it's a different format. In the next few years, I'm sure we're going to be working with virtual reality much more intensely. And
Very
that's going to be
excited for
very
that.
different again.
Yes.
Yeah. It the fact that we're having this interview at all is an example of the growth in technology. Because
Absolutely.
although an intercontinental interview has been possible for a long time, it was not at our level of being.
Exactly. This would used to require very expensive equipment and
Hmm.
satellites and that the company had to own and things like that. And now
Yeah,
it's just freely available with our internet, which is wonderful. Yeah.
it really is.
And going back to Lady Crystal,
Hmm.
I also remember as I was editing the book, the stories that you would bring
Hmm.
out from your childhood, and I think that's something that in particular will fascinate a lot of Correllians.
Hmm.
Of course, we revere the Correll family. We revere our ancestors, including our living
Hmm.
ancestors that have so much wisdom to share with us, and learning about what a little piece of life was like with those ancestors who have already passed. It
Hmm.
was just a very enlightened. It made people who were just in books before suddenly seem real, and they weren't just names mentioned under beloved anymore. They were more human.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are a number of stories throughout the book. Um, I know right at the very beginning we talk about the ancestor altars and how they were used when I was growing up, and we talk in various places about various things that happened, and I don't remember all the different stories I put in there, but I know they're in there. Um, but I think we talk about. I think that we included the story where we had the spirits knocking on the door or opening the door, and that's one of the more memorable memories that I have. It was in the mid 1980s, and not to give away the whole story, but it had to do with physical manifestations, which we don't normally have a lot of. It's not what we normally do, but they do happen. And in this case, it was a very important ritual. And as we're setting up to begin, the door opens. Um, it had been securely closed, but
Someone
I
else
mean,
wanted to join.
yeah, that was our conclusion. Our first thought was, maybe the wind blew it open, but we're going to assume it's a spirit because of what we're doing. And Lady Crystal welcomed the spirit, closed the door, came back to the ritual, and it opened again. And it continued from there. That's one of the stories, and it is one of the things I think it illustrates about her is her flexibility, which was very, very important, and her willingness to adapt to whatever was happening. Um, it did not fluster her at all to have a sudden, unexpected physical um, development, and it was great confirmation for all of us of how important it was that we were doing this particular work. Um, what other good stories are in here? I know there are some regarding Lady Bitterwind.
Yes, and there was also a discussion around how the altar would be set up and the process that that would go through,
Hmm.
and what was included on it, and what was done with the altar itself. And I found that fascinating because it's like looking into a little piece of Correllian history, recent history, but
Hmm.
still history, and having that kind of window right into your home, your childhood home, and
Yeah,
seeing what that life was like for you. Yeah.
it was interesting. We've talked about it in a previous interview as
Yes.
well.
Yes.
And in some ways it was exactly what we do today. In some ways it was very different. Um, but that's what you would expect with the passage of however many years I've lived now. It's rather a few.
Yes, and
Um, yeah.
yeah, and one of the things that I wanted to point out, going back to the fact that she was flexible, but she
Hmm.
was also just instantly willing to show respect,
Yes.
just in case, just in
Hmm.
case it was a spirit joining, and just
Yeah.
that willingness to just immediately show kindness
Hmm.
towards someone who may or may not even actually be there, but just in case
Yes,
there was
indeed.
kindness shown. Yeah.
And that's very much how Lady Crystal is. And the spirits then made very clear to us that it was in fact them,
Yes. Yes.
and it was quite memorable.
Abs-
There's another point where we're talking about Lady Bitterwind, although I've told this story many times, but about how she pointed out to us that our way of interacting with the ancestors seemed overly restrained to her, considering the stories we told about the ancestors, and that she pointed out her thought that we were censoring them into being very dignified and very serious all the time when they really weren't, and that we needed to give them permission to express themselves completely. And so we went to them and we said, "Ancestors, are we censoring you?" And their answer literally was, "Duh." And from that point on, they were much more humorous and much more wide ranging, because we had in fact been censoring them, because we had been raised to work with them in this very dignified and respectful way. Um, but I think that the fuller expression is far superior.
yeah.
So, but it took Lady Bitterwind to point it out. But then she pointed out many things, because she, like Sir Edward, she saw things differently than than ordinary people do.
Yeah.
And sometimes you need that that person who sees what everyone else is missing. And Lady Bitterwind was that person.
And I find that is also something that's true in lots of stories about religious figures
Hmm.
from history. Religious figures currently is that, while they're very quite dignified when they're doing their ritual ceremonies, when they're performing their duties in private, they can be quite hilarious people and very engaging. Yeah.
For many years there was the general belief that I had no sense of humor. I think we may have dispelled that by now, but I do in fact have a sense of humor. But I was talking with Sir Jason about this the other day, and he said the thing about my sense of humor is that it's totally deadpan, and I will slip it in when you're not expecting it. And a lot of times people don't realize there was a joke, and the other thing is it tends to be rather obscure sometimes. So sometimes they never know there was a joke, but I get a little chuckle out of it.
And I think that's the important part, as long as we can make ourselves laugh. Absolutely. Yeah. So telling me, talking about some of the other memories you had, there was actually a special altar set up in your
Hmm.
childhood home for your sister Linda.
Yes.
Could you tell us a little bit about how that was different from your standard ancestral altar?
Well, the primary thing that made it different is that it was a holiday altar. It went up at the midwinter holidays and came down afterwards, but it honored her specifically um, as an individual ancestor, whereas usually we honored all of the ancestors together. And what it was a tree, a holiday tree in her honor. And if I remember correctly, it was a white plastic miniature tree originally, and then became one of those silver trees they had in the 60s. Um, and things were on this altar from her childhood. I mean, she died at the age of 4. Everything was from her childhood, and she would receive holiday gifts there. And I could not tell you much about those gifts except for one. After my mother died, we went through my grandmother's things that she had not gone through in all the years since my grandmother died, and one of them was her last gift to my sister. And it was an orange nightdress with a letter um, the kind of letter that you would write to a spirit, and its primary focus was you will never be forgotten. We will always remember you. And that was her last gift for her granddaughter, delayed all those years. But what happened is at a certain point, um, they stopped the practice of that holiday altar because they felt that owing to reincarnation, it was no longer necessary. And of course, Linda is still honored among the ancestors, but not quite in the same way. And we talk about in the book how you can be an ancestor and be reincarnated at the same time because the soul is just not that straightforward. It's much more complex than that. So when we talk about the ancestors, we're talking about an aspect of the soul that remains there, even though other parts of the soul go on and are reborn um, in many different ways. And so Linda is certainly still there. We don't, I mean, she only, well, I suppose it's not surprising she would not speak to me very often. She speaks to Lady Alyssa frequently, who is the currently the first priestess co-regent, um, and particularly on issues involving children. And Linda died when she was just 4 years old. She drowned in a gravel pit, which is a term I don't think anyone will have heard in several generations, but at the time it was a thing. And it was in February of 1949. And the what happened is she was playing a few doors from our home with some of her friends, and they decided that they would like to go see my grandmother. And they asked the friend's mother if that was all right. My grandmother lived 2 or 3 doors away from them. No big deal, except that's not the grandmother they meant. And so they started, instead of going to my maternal grandmother's home a few doors away, they started hiking across town to my paternal grandmother, and they never got there. Not only did they not get there, but when it was noticed they were missing, nobody had any idea where they were because they thought they'd gone somewhere else. So it was a very traumatic period for the family, and that involves a whole number of stories of its own that we've talked about in various places. Because for a time it seemed as if the branch of the family my mother represented was not going to go forward because there were no heirs past her. That changed, and they found ways to change it. And one of the changes was when I myself was born unexpectedly and provided another generation. But that's part of why the tradition ceased to focus on being a familial tradition, because the family wasn't doing a particularly good job surviving. Um, not a lot of children, and not not robust in that sense. Now, it's done a little better than I think we thought for a while it was going to do, because we do have future generations, and we've expanded since then through adoption. And because what you do when you don't have a lot of children, you adopt.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
sometimes even when you do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate, I know that's a very difficult story maybe to tell, as well as for some people to hear, but it really humanizes your sister Linda,
Mhm.
because I can also think of times where I have maybe not quite told the complete truth to my
Mhm.
mother about where I was going when I had it out, and maybe used, some covert language to do that.
Yeah,
And how sometimes that can, just end up leading us on some, maybe some paths that we weren't intending to go on in life. Absolutely. And
absolutely.
yeah, but yeah, it's definitely something that makes her a real person, when
Mhm.
you hear that story. Um, Now, in the book, you talk about the differences between all these types of entities that
Yes.
exist: ghosts, spirits, souls, poltergeists. Can you elaborate a bit on those differences for our listeners?
Um, well, the first thing I should say is when we're talking about semantics, many different groups use words differently. This is how I understand it from the background I come from, and I think it's the general understanding. But when we talk about the soul, we're talking about the part of our life that goes forward, and we'll come back to it in a few minutes. But that's basically what we're talking about. When we're talking about a ghost, um, we're talking about the part of our energy that can get caught after death between lives. And when that happens, sometimes it's only a little bit of energy, in which case you get just a little bit of a ghost. Sometimes it's a lot. Um, because of the nature of incarnation, um, you know, most of the soul may pass over, but some may be caught. And this is part of the shadow that, as a living person, we may still be dealing with, because part of us is still stuck in that previous lifetime. And when you see, particularly some of the famous ghosts in history, they are this. They are that little bit of trapped energy that cannot move forward. Some people have thought of them as being a recording. I would say that they're a small part of trapped energy of the being, and that through spiritual healing techniques we can free it up and move them along, and the being can reclaim that energy. But a ghost is caught between the worlds. And if you happen to meet a ghost, the best thing to do is to try to help them to cross over. Now, they may or may not be willing, it may or may not be time, but the best thing to do is to make that attempt. I had one friend who was horrified by ghost tourism because she felt like it was keeping the ghosts in little cages for amusement when
Oh,
you should help them cross over. Um, and I get that. I not not quite that extreme in my view, but I do think that it's best to try to help any trapped spirit to cross over. Um, a poltergeist, on the other hand, is not a spirit. Um, it is basically ungrounded energy acting out. And a poltergeist is where you get things that move around unexpectedly, or sometimes furniture will shake or items will come off of shelves for no other reason and with no other particular phenomenon. Occasionally, it's been associated with things like
teenage rebellion or
it's usually
anxiety.
associated with the presence of either a teenager or someone else who is experiencing hormonal changes,
Mhm.
and occasionally someone who is just learning about psychic matters, enough to have opened themselves, but not enough to really be in charge of what they're doing yet. And the thing about a poltergeist, pardon me, is that the way you deal with it is you ground the energy. That's all it takes. But, and I was reminded, I did a psychic fair this weekend. I was reminded in talking with one of the psychics that not all backgrounds emphasize grounding or even teach it at all. And she was explaining to me how she'd had to learn it well into her psychic career, and how it answered so many questions for her when she did. Um, but with poltergeists, and sometimes things that don't even necessarily rise to that name, ungrounded energy can cause a lot of effects that are not necessarily good. So it's always best to have it grounded. Um,
Absolutely.
there are certain occasions that are exceptions to this, like if you have an active temple that is always dedicated,
Mm.
you may want to keep your energy higher, but you still want to keep it focused. So you're still practicing psychic hygiene, it's just not quite the same way. Um, a spirit, as I use that term, spirit is a very broadly used term. I frequently use spirit as a neutral term for deity. I use it as a term for psychic energy, but it's also a part of our being. And when I use when I use spirit in that sense, it's the part of us that goes on and becomes an ancestor or otherwise exists in the afterlife and goes from one life to the next. Very similar to the soul, but the soul also corresponds to a particular plane of existence.
Mm.
And the soul is where all of those experiences are maintained in the being. The things that we learn in our incarnations, we learn through the soul and through all those different incarnations, which may not be connected anywhere but at the soul level, because of the complex nature of incarnation. Because any one soul, people often think of it as a single continuous line, but it's more like a spider web. It goes out in all directions. Souls frequently split in many directions. If you think of it like a tree branch, you're closer to what incarnation is. So if you were doing, and if you look at nature, almost everything follows that same branch pattern. If you look at the paths of a river, they often will show the same thing. If you look at the blood vessels in our own bodies, they look the same. But if you are going through your own karmic disentanglement, going back through your own incarnations, you will find that at certain points, how can I put it? Different lines will link together where they previously split apart.
And this is something that we also hear about in quantum physics as well, that a single point can exist in two locations at the same time.
Yeah.
So can the soul. Yeah.
And I think I would ultimately say that is kind of the nature of the universe, that we're all the single point existing in billions of places. And that takes us back to Empedocles and the idea that deity is, I think the exact phrase, deity is a circle whose circumference, whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere, if I remember correctly the phrase. And deity is in everything, but perceives itself being separate because its consciousness at that moment is farther down in the branch. As you work up the branch, you begin to realize how unique our individual incarnations are, but how unified our inner nature is. One of the things that I found very surprising in doing karmic disentanglement is that the deeper you go, the more universal the subjects become. And things that you might never have thought were in you, you find are there.
Yeah.
And still need healing. Because in the end, it's the same energy running through all of us.
Yeah.
And we often have a very false idea of how the world should be based on how we want the world to be. And there's nothing at all incorrect about wanting the world to be a certain way and working to make it that way. But we have to recognize that we have a distance to go. Yeah. And we forget that sometimes.
Absolutely. We do have a question from the audience,
Oh,
actually.
wonderful.
Elena's asked, she has something that, she explained she has something in her house. It's in only one bedroom, but anytime that she sleeps in there, her cover gets pulled down from her. So, and also once she felt held down, and felt like a breeze or energy moving upward towards her head, and then it released. And that happened only one time in there, but and she has smudged the area. But any ideas about what that particular situation could have involved?
Well, I can give a couple of ideas. Without knowing anything more about it, could have been working with spirit guides unconsciously. One of the things I learned long ago, when you work with your spirit guides, they will do energetic healing with you sometimes. And sometimes you have to be immobile for that, because what they're doing interacts with the physical body and it needs not to move. So if she felt held down, it could be that for some reason there was an energetic process going on with her guides that she needed to stay still for. That's one possibility. Could have been a poltergeist experience also. Um, but because it happened only one time, I would say that whatever it was, she dealt with it just fine and doesn't need to worry about it any further.
And I've had several, actually several similar experiences. Probably once or twice a month, I will wake up,
Hmm.
but I will still be within my body. I cannot move my body. I can't even
Hmm.
open my eyes, and I still feel like I'm stuck in both the astral plane as
Hmm.
well as stuck in my body at the same time. And it will
And that's pretty much
take,
it.
yeah, it just takes up my body a few minutes to realize, oh, I'm now coming back. Let's finish that. Let's
Hmm.
here, and then we can open our eyes. Don't rush it.
Yeah.
And part of me will panic a bit that,
Hmm.
oh, I'm stuck in my body and I can't open my eyes. But it has been through doing shadow work and through doing things like that that I realized that this is something that, one, is easy to get out of if I
Yep.
focus on it, and two, doesn't have to be something scary. Yeah.
Exactly.
And Elena says she has never felt afraid with this. So when this
Yeah.
has happened to her. So yeah.
So I'm inclined to say that it may very well have been spirit guides. And like I say, when they do energy work, sometimes it's important that the subject not move. And in fact, if you as an energy worker are doing energy work with someone, sometimes it's important they not move.
Yeah.
But when we're all conscious, we just say that don't move right now. Um, and in fact, usually when you're doing energy work for a person, that they're not going to move.
Mm,
It just doesn't enter into the process. Um, but some of these things are more intense than others. I was doing a class on psychic healing the other night, and we were talking about acupuncture as being one of the forms of healing that uses the chakras and the meridians. Um, Although, of course, there is a different Chinese term for a chakra, but it's the same concept. And you'll hear people say that acupuncture is based on nerve endings and things like that. It's based on the energetic system of the body, as understood in Chinese thought. But when you're working with those tiny little chakras, yeah, you don't necessarily want to move
mm.
because you're trying to get the energy to flow in a certain way through the meridians. And it can be problematic to have unexpected movements. Sometimes it's also unavoidable, and there are things you do. But I would say that probably is the source of this experience.
Yeah, I would have to say, like, if I was doing Reiki on someone, for example, it would be quite difficult to maintain focus if they were constantly moving around.
Yes.
So yeah, yeah, that's definitely. And Elena says that that makes sense to her, and gives her thanks for that. So thank you, Elena, as well for sharing that. That's one of the great things about these live shows is that we can take questions from the audience like this and really give someone immediately some kind of
Hmm.
help or assistance with this. So thank you, Elena. Yeah, and moving on into the discussions around, we'll bring it back with what you were talking about earlier. You had your own kind of near death experience earlier
Oh
this
yeah.
year, and that may have been one of the catalysts to get you moving on this book.
It was.
Yeah, and that's I think something that, of course, everyone starts to think about the contemplation of their own mortality, and not just how do I want to live the rest of my life, but how do I want to die with dignity?
Hmm.
What's the best way for people to celebrate my death when I'm gone? And this book really gave me a lot of ideas about that from the Correllian perspective of
Hmm.
things. Yeah. So can you maybe elaborate a bit on that and how that was for you with thinking about and contemplating your own mortality?
Well, it's not the first time I've come close to dying, but probably, what is the right word for that? I'd have to say I was more affected in some ways by this one than by previous ones. I was able to get up on my feet faster in the past, having been significantly younger in the past. Um, and for various other reasons, it definitely, for several months, I didn't feel like I was completely alive.
Mm.
And, I would go so far as to say maybe I wasn't. Um, it took a while to um, to rekindle that focus, and it does make you look at a lot of things. Um, and between that and the way that the whole year has gone, it really was a time to look at what really matters, what matters less, what you leave behind when you go, what you take with you. Um, and it was very much, and I think for anyone who finds themselves facing death, it is a time to really reassess your priorities and to take a good look at who you are. And of course, one of the big questions was, am I afraid to go now? Which I was not. Um, but am I ready to go now? Which in the end, I was not either.
Mm.
Um, it I'm definitely not a believer in the idea of living as long as you can just because. Um, but at the same time, I think there is a certain truth in the idea that if you're still here, you probably still have something to do. And I think sometimes we have to ask ourselves, well, what is there left for us to do after what we've already done? And sometimes there's still a lot there, and sometimes it's purely personal. I found, looking at my own life, that I've done a lot of work in my life. I've done a lot of writing in my life. I've done a lot of artwork in my life. I've done a lot of video in my life. I've worked with lots of people in my life. Um, One thing that I've tended to ignore is myself personally. And one of the big issues that came up for me was the difference between being we and being I.
Mm.
And I'm not entirely sure I've ever been I until now. My life was all about we. And I'm still working with that. But one of the questions was about joy in life. And I've certainly had joy, but I never particularly prioritized it for myself, but for us, if you follow.
Yes, absolutely. This is
And I
really,
yeah,
yeah.
and I knew this. If you ask me, I would say, people ask me, what do I like? Well, outside of work, I don't know if there is anything. Um,
Sometimes I have that same conversation with people.
yeah,
Yeah.
and finding those things for myself um, is one of the things I've had to kind of look at. And I'm not quite sure yet what to say for all of that, except that's one of the things I have been focusing on.
That really resonates with my own personal journey as well, and some of my own shadow work, especially around sacrificing my happiness to make
Hmm.
other people happy in life,
Yep.
which is something I did for the first 32 years of my life, to the point where I even married a man that I wasn't really in love with
Hmm.
because it was expected.
Yeah.
And it would make other people happy if I did, and that it was um, it was wrong for both me and for him.
Hmm.
It was wrong to do because it limited both of us from actually finding true happiness
Yeah.
and finding our own paths in the world for half our lives, basically, and stepping out of that situation and then figuring out who I was if I wasn't part of this duo or this family unit anymore. Who am I just as an individual?
Hmm.
And what are the things that I enjoy that have absolutely nothing to do with anyone else's happiness but my own? That was it's an ongoing journey. I'm still learning who I
Yeah.
am. Yeah. And
And
yes,
I think
what you
as
say
long as we're
resonates.
here,
Mhm.
it's an ongoing journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And something that really hit me as I was reading this book was the idea of how does one? There's a lot of information in the world about how to live well,
Hmm.
how to live your best life, but there's less information in the world about how to die well and
Yeah.
how to plan your death, your passing, your afterlife.
Hmm.
That is a limited. There is a limited amount of material available on that. So, and you give quite a bit of advice throughout the book on what it means to die well.
Hmm.
Both as individually, as a Correllian, as a pagan. So how would you define, or maybe uh, quantify what it means to die well?
Oh. Well, that's a question. But there's an answer for it. There is an old saying, today is a good day to die.
Yeah. Klingon, I believe.
And the way I understand that is that if it's always a good day to die if you've done the things that you needed to do to the best of your ability, and you can say, there was nothing else I could do.
Yeah.
And I think that probably in the end um, kind of answers that question for me, how to die well, to have done the best that you could do in the first place. And if you find there's still more to do, then it's not time to die.
Yeah.
Still more that needs to be handled. And and sometimes, I'm a great believer that near-death experiences come at times of major transition.
Hmm.
And it's not going to happen if there's not a lot to be examined and dealt with. And sometimes it's things you never thought were wrong, but they still have to be dealt with. Things that you didn't realize were not working, but they still have to be dealt with. And I think this is true also sometimes with major illnesses. They're partly there to draw your attention to what you need to fix in life. And it and there does come a point when you've done everything you can do, and at that point, it's fine.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's frequent,
And
but it will
sometimes life.
always come and go.
Yes, yeah, and I think you're absolutely right about the overlap between major life changes and major life illnesses or brushes with death.
Mhm.
Also, I do want to throw in here, Elena is commenting in that she plans to find out more and more about life, and she's not ever going to be ready to die. And I think that is I have a similar thought process with that as well. It's not that I don't, ever expect to die. Sometime at some point I will, and it may happen quite suddenly when I least expect it.
Mhm.
But uh,
Well, that's the best way,
right, but
arguably.
as I was going through my process, about 7 years ago, with going through change, figuring out who I was as a human being, separate from everyone else. I was also going through major life illnesses,
Mhm.
life-threatening events, and fairly regularly over the next several years. And I think part of that was to make me realize that one, life is short,
Mhm.
and two, if I'm going to die, I might as well be doing something that I enjoy, something that I believe in, something that I find
Mhm.
important or worthy. Um,
Well,
yeah.
that's I've known a lot of death in my life. Um, I know there are some people who don't experience their first close death until they're an adult. I've heard of people in their 40s having their first close death, and I'm surprised when I meet people my own age whose parents are still living. I can't even imagine that. But I know it's not uncommon.
Yeah.
But in my life, I was introduced to death very early, and I've known a lot of people whose lives have ended, and some were in very good places, and it was a good day for them to die, and some of them n- not quite as much. And the worst thing that I have seen are people who are just waiting to die. They're acting life as though their life is already over, and not doing well, not living really at that point. And um, my attitude is, as long as you are alive, you should try to remain alive. And talking about this year, the first part of the year, I was in a different space. Um, it's like I was not wholly here, and I feel much more centered in the world of the living at present.
Yeah. Yes. And that's speaking of, I've had as well quite a bit of death in my life,
Hmm.
starting from a very young age. As a child, one of my cousins was 2 years old, and he died of brain
Hmm.
cancer. And there's nothing sadder than going to a child's funeral and listening to
Yeah,
them play lullabies like he's just going to wake up any minute.
yeah.
Especially when you're also a young child and you're trying to navigate death from a very limited perspective. And also, as well, growing up, I lost grandparents.
Mm.
I've lost friends to gun violence, to drug overdoses. My part of Texas was not known for success stories coming out of that area, but a lot of tragic stories for sure.
Hmm.
And I think that because of that is why I get so driven to complete the goals that I have in life, to
Hmm.
keep pushing myself forward, even when I have setbacks. Sometimes to the point where I exhaust myself, and my body just says, "Hey, cut it out for a little while. You need to also rest."
Yeah,
Yeah, but is there? Do you feel like there's that pressure to get everything done before time is up, before the hourglass runs out?
I certainly have felt that way historically. That kind of describes my life. Um, Not quite sure how I'd answer that now, but historically, that whole I and we thing, there was so much that had to be done for we,
Yeah.
and very, very little of it was really about me. And there's nothing wrong with that. But 44 years was long enough to be we, and time to be a little bit of I.
Yeah.
Um, and I find I am looking at things a little differently with that change. But when you're in a position where you're responsible for an organization, a group, a number of people, it's very different than if you're just a person. And it's very hard to balance those two things, especially when you take it on so very young. And we talk about conscious incarnation at some length in the book. Um, and I believe myself to be a conscious incarnate. I was raised with the idea that I was a conscious incarnate. And I certainly played the part. I took up my role at a very early age and fit into it in a very adult way, all things considered, if I say so myself. However, for this life, um, in some ways, it it didn't get as developed as it might have done if I hadn't had all the work to do. The work was the development. So now, having this little postscript on life, there's a little more focus. I think, or I'm hoping to have more focus on things that are for my own enjoyment of life. And it's not that I have no idea what those things are, but most of my life I was so busy working as we that the things for me rarely had time to happen.
Yeah.
And we'll see what happens now.
That
One of my
definitely.
oh, go ahead.
Go no, 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 go ahead. One of your.
One of my favorite films is The Adding Machine. I often talk about it, and it has the main message of The Adding Machine is not to get completely caught up in your work to the point that you forget yourself. And yet, there with it as a message in the very first part of my life, I'd have to say, in some ways, I did get caught up in my work to the exclusion of myself. But there was also an awful lot of work to do, so I don't regret that. Um, But one of the things this year has meant for me is that difference between I and we. And I think I would say to everyone, make sure you keep an eye on your I as well as your we.
Great
Um,
advice.
thank you.
Yeah. And also, Tom says good morning. So good morning to Tom. Thank you for joining us. But yeah, my thoughts regarding that are quite similar. As you know, I run Speak Your Own Book, but technically Maureen runs Speak Your Own Book these days.
Okay.
Our wonderful scheduler, and I have not actually, except for the projects that I've chosen to do over the past 6 months, I've not had to directly involve myself with much of anything day to day, which is a bit of a new thing for me. I'm
Mm,
still adjusting to that concept that hey, I can start exploring some other things that I would like to do, other passions that I have, while this business that I put 3 years of really hard work into starts to take off by itself.
mm,
And hopefully will continue long after I'm gone, and evolve and adapt in whatever ways the company needs.
mm,
But it's again, it's devoting myself to a we for so long that now it's time to pull back and say, oh, what makes me happy again?
mm.
And
Absolutely.
yeah, that's a difficult conversation to have. I also think that, especially if you are a religious figure
Mm,
who has been a religious figure since childhood,
mm,
there is that additional pressure of that you are here for service, for a lifetime of service,
mm,
and trying to find that balance between this responsibility, this duty, this calling that you have,
mm,
in comparison to what genuinely makes you happy, what genuinely makes you content with life. That
mm.
I'm assuming, at least from what I've heard from your stories, as well as from other religious figures who have spoken on the subject, that that's a very common thing
Mm.
across religious figures who started in childhood.
I would imagine it must be.
Mhm.
And I do want to say that I have enjoyed my career. I
Yeah,
mean, that was a source of pleasure. Um, like I say, it's the difference between I and we that I find myself focusing on. Not that I regret the choices that I made or the options that were before me, but rather that I find some new ones now.
yeah, absolutely. And having that opportunity to explore that,
Hmm.
it's a difficult blessing, but it is in the end a blessing, because many people in this lifetime will not experience that, do not get that opportunity. And hopefully maybe in the next lifetime they will. But at least for this lifetime it may be quite limited. For what they can explore for themselves.
Mm.
That if we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, self-actualization is way up there at the top, so it's the
Yep.
last thing that we ever achieve, if we ever achieve it. So while I'm very thankful to be at self-actualization, it's definitely a challenge, especially since you still have to maintain all of those
Oh
other
yes.
needs beneath it. Yes. So and how is do you have any advice, just final advice for our listeners, for if they're contemplating death, or maybe they've had a recent near death experience and they're reevaluating things in their life? What do you recommend? Besides the book, of course. Everyone should get the book. Yeah.
Yes, of course, I recommend the book.
Yes.
But I think I would go back to what we were saying earlier about today being a good day to die,
Mhm.
and ask yourself, is it a good day? And if not, why not? And address those issues. And you don't actually have to be thinking that it's going to be the last day to have that assessment, but rather, are you where you need to be if it does turn out to be the last day? I
Yeah.
mean, have you done your death cleaning, as they call it, where you have prepared for those who are coming after, so they don't have to go through the house, so to speak, but
Yeah.
they can find what's there for them easily? Have you gotten your affairs in order or kept them in order? And if not, why not?
Yeah, that's excellent advice, and that's something that I'm actually doing right now because given my health status over the last several years, if something does happen to me, I want to make sure that this business continues
Mhm.
on without me, that all the access to the accounts will be shared, that people will be able to take over parts that I played in that, and that the legacy I leave behind will be a long-lasting one that continues to make impact.
Yeah,
And yeah, absolutely. So that's excellent advice. Thank you so much for joining us today, Reverend Donald Lewis. And please visit CorrellianPublishing.com to order the Correllian Book of the Dead. Can you show us the book cover one more time, Reverend Don?
I can.
Wonderful. That beautiful purple book. It also works perfectly with all the rest of your books, so they'll look beautiful
Yes,
lined up on your bookshelf. So please check that out, everyone that's listening. Elena wishes us blessings for our full success, and Elizabeth says she will watch this later. She is saving the video, so we appreciate you,
wonderful.
Elizabeth. Thank you all so much for joining, and Reverend Don, thank you as well. And we
Thank
will
you.
see you next time. Bye, everybody.